Pack your things, Mom. You're moving out this week. Daniel said it like he was reminding me about a dentist appointment, not uprooting the life I had built over 42 years in that house. I didn't answer right away. I just stood there in the kitchen, my hand still resting on the edge of the counter, feeling the faint vibration of the refrigerator humming beneath my palm. Rebecca was behind him, leaning casually against the doorway, arms crossed, her expression composed in that careful way she had perfected over the years, pleasant on the surface, but empty underneath. I looked from my son to his wife, waiting for one of them to soften, to explain, to laugh, and say it was all a misunderstanding. Neither of them did. The afternoon light streamed through the window above the sink, catching the dust in the air, turning it into something almost beautiful. It struck me then how quiet the house had become since my husband passed 6 months ago. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you notice things you used to overlook. It's for the best, Rebecca added, her voice smooth, almost rehearsed. You'll be more comfortable somewhere with people your age. I nodded slowly, as if I were considering her words, but something inside me had already begun to shift. Because comfort had never been the problem. This house was not too big for me. It was not too expensive. It was not too much. I had managed it through decades of birthdays, holidays, repairs, and late-night worries. I had managed it through my husband's illness, through hospital visits and medication schedules and quiet prayers whispered into the dark. I had managed everything. So why now? Daniel finally met my eyes, but only for a second. Just long enough for me to see it. Not concern, not even guilt, just avoidance. We've already started making arrangements, he said, clearing his throat. There's a really nice place about 20 miles from here. Clean, safe, good staff. 20 miles. Not across the country. Not far enough to sound cruel. Just far enough to make me disappear from their daily lives. I turned slightly, glancing at the family photos lined up along the counter. There was one of Daniel at 8 years old, missing his front teeth, grinning up at me with frosting smeared across his cheeks. Another of my husband standing proudly beside the oak tree he planted the year we moved in. Every inch of this house held something I had protected, something I had nurtured. And now they were standing in my kitchen, speaking as if I were a piece of furniture that needed to be relocated. When? I asked quietly. By the end of the week, Rebecca answered before Daniel could speak. Too quickly, too certain. My eyes moved back to her, and for the first time, I noticed something I hadn't before. Not in her words, but in her posture. The way she stood just slightly forward, as if this had been her idea all along. As if she had already decided the outcome. I gave a small nod, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then I turned back to the sink and picked up the dish I had been washing before they walked in. All right, I said, my voice steady, almost calm. If that's what you think is best. I could feel their relief immediately, like a weight lifting off the room. Daniel exhaled softly. Rebecca uncrossed her arms. They had expected resistance, maybe even a fight, but I gave them nothing. And that was the moment everything changed. Because as I stood there, rinsing that same plate over and over under running water, I realized something very simple. People don't rush you out of your own home in a week unless they've already planned what comes next. And whatever came next, they hadn't told me about it. I did not sleep that night. The house felt different after they left, as if the walls themselves had heard the conversation and were waiting for me to catch up. I sat at the kitchen table long after the sun had gone down, staring at the same spot where Daniel had stood, replaying his words over and over in my mind. You are moving out this week. Not next month. Not after we talk about it. This week. It was too fast. Too final. I had lived in this house for over 4 decades. I had buried a husband, raised a son, planted a garden that still bloomed every spring without fail. Nothing about my life had ever moved that quickly. Not. Unless someone had already decided the ending before I even knew the story had begun. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, just before 6. The kind of early that used to belong to school mornings and packed lunches, back when Daniel would stumble into the kitchen half asleep and complain about oatmeal. I made coffee out of habit, measuring it carefully, listening to the familiar drip of the machine as if it might steady my thoughts. The kitchen looked the same. Everything was exactly where it had always been. But something underneath had shifted. I could feel it. I carried my cup into the living room and paused in the doorway. The curtains were slightly open, letting in a pale strip of morning light across the hardwood floor. That was when I noticed it. A small stack of papers sitting neatly on the coffee table. They had not been there the night before. I set my cup down slowly, the ceramic making a soft sound against the wood, and walked over. The top page was printed on thick white paper, the kind people use when they want something to feel official. I did not need to read the title to know what it was. I recognized the format immediately. Admission agreement. My fingers hovered just above the page for a moment before I picked it up. The facility name was listed at the top, along with an address I did not recognize. There were sections already filled out. My name, my date of birth, even my emergency contact. Daniel Collins. Of course. I turned the page. Signatures. Not mine. But everything else was prepared. As if all that was missing was my agreement. As if my life could be reduced to a blank line waiting for a pen. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not panic, not even anger. Something quieter. Sharper. I flipped through the rest of the documents, scanning quickly now. Payment arrangements. Room assignments. Policies about visitation hours. It was all there. Every detail decided. Every step mapped out. And no one had thought to include me in any of it. I placed the papers back exactly where I had found them, aligning the edges carefully. Then I stepped back and looked at the room again. At the photographs on the wall. At the furniture my husband had insisted on refinishing himself. At the space that had held every version of my life. This was not about safety. This was not about comfort. This was about control. Later that afternoon, Daniel called. His voice was lighter than it had been the day before, almost relieved. Hey, Mom. Just wanted to check in. Did you get a chance to think about what we talked about? I glanced toward the living room, toward the papers still sitting exactly where I had left them. I did, I said. There was a pause, just long enough for him to brace himself. And he asked. I let the silence stretch for a moment, the way I used to when he was a boy, and I wanted him to tell me the truth without being asked twice. I think you are right, I said finally. It might be time for a change. The relief in his voice was immediate, almost eager. That is great, Mom. Really, you are going to like it there. It is a good place. I nodded, even though he could not see me. I am sure I will, I said softly. But as I stood there, holding the phone to my ear, my eyes drifted back to the hallway that led to my bedroom, to the closet where I kept the old files, to the documents my husband had organized years ago, long before any of this had started. And for the first time since Daniel had spoken those words in my kitchen, I allowed myself a small, quiet realization. If they had already made their plans without me, then perhaps it was time I started making my own. I waited until the house was completely still before I went to the bedroom. Not the guest room Daniel thought I used now, but the one at the end of the hallway. The one that still smelled faintly like my husband's cologne if you stood close enough to the dresser. I closed the door quietly behind me and walked to the closet, pushing aside the neatly hung coats until my fingers found the small metal lockbox on the top shelf. It was heavier than I remembered. I carried it to the bed and sat down slowly, the mattress dipping beneath me in a way that felt familiar, grounding. For a moment, I just rested my hand on the lid, remembering the last time I had opened it. It had been 3 years ago, when my husband insisted we go through everything together. Just in case, he had said, his voice calm, practical, the way it always was when he talked about things I did not want to think about. I had laughed it off back then, told him he was being dramatic. But he had not argued. He had simply organized everything, labeled each folder, and shown me where it would all be if I ever needed it. I needed it now. I opened the box, and the faint smell of paper and time rose up to meet me. Inside were the documents he had prepared, each one placed with care. Property records, financial accounts, legal papers I had barely glanced at before because I trusted that there would always be more time. I picked up the folder labeled House and opened it carefully. My name was there, not alongside his, not beneath it. Mine, sole ownership, transferred quietly the year before he passed. I felt my breath catch, not from shock, but from the realization of what that meant. Daniel did not know. Rebecca definitely did not know. To them, this house was something waiting to be claimed, something that would naturally pass into their hands the moment I stepped aside. But that was not how it was written. That was not how it had ever been intended. I closed the folder and reached for another one. Accounts. There were notes in my husband's handwriting, small and precise, explaining what each one was for, what it could be used for, what needed to be protected. He had thought of everything, even the possibility that I might one day be pressured, persuaded, or quietly pushed into decisions that were not my own. I sat there for a long time, the papers spread out across the bed, the afternoon light shifting slowly across the room as the hours passed. The house was silent again, but it no longer felt empty. It felt watchful, as if it was waiting for me to decide what I was going to do next. By the time I placed the documents back into the box, my hands were steady. Not because I felt safe, but because I understood the situation clearly now. This was never about my well-being. This was about timing. Their timing. They had chosen a week. They had chosen speed. They had assumed I would be too overwhelmed, too emotional, too tired to question anything. They had assumed wrong. The next morning, Rebecca arrived unannounced. She knocked twice before letting herself in, her voice already calling out before the door had fully opened. "Margaret, I brought some brochures. I thought we could go over options together." I stepped into the hallway just as she entered, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She smiled when she saw me, that same practiced smile, warm but distant. "There are some really lovely places," she continued, holding up a glossy stack of papers. "Private rooms, daily activities, transportation. It is all very well organized." I took the brochures from her without looking at them. "That sounds nice," I said evenly. She watched me for a moment, as if trying to read something beneath the surface. "We should probably schedule a visit soon," she added. "Places like this fill up quickly." Of course they do, I thought. Everything about this was moving quickly. Too quickly. I nodded once. "I am sure you have already found a good one." Her smile widened slightly, just enough to confirm what I already knew. "We have," she said. "We." Not Daniel. Not the family. Her. I turned and walked toward the kitchen, setting the brochures down beside the stack of admission papers still resting on the table. For a brief moment, her eyes flicked toward them, and I saw it. Recognition. Calculation. Expectation. I reached for the coffee pot and poured myself another cup, the dark liquid filling the mug in a steady stream. "I will need a few days to get everything in order," I said calmly. "Of course," Rebecca replied quickly. "Take your time." But her tone said something else. Not too much time. Not enough time to change anything. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the warmth settle into my fingers, and gave her a small, polite nod. Because she believed she was guiding this process. She believed she had already won, and I was going to let her keep believing that. For now, I spent the rest of that afternoon moving through the house slowly, not packing, not organizing, just observing. It was strange how different everything looked once I knew the truth. The hallway seemed longer. The rooms felt quieter, but not in the same empty way as before. This time, the silence had weight. I paused in the living room, running my fingers lightly along the back of the armchair my husband used to sit in every evening. He had a habit of tapping his fingers against the wood when he was thinking, a soft rhythm that used to fill the space without me even noticing. I noticed it now. I noticed everything. That evening, Daniel came by after work. He did not call first. He rarely did anymore. The door opened with a quick turn of his key, and he stepped inside like he still belonged here without question. "Hey, Mom," he said, setting his keys on the entry table. "Rebecca told me she stopped by earlier. Did you look at the brochures?" I was in the kitchen, standing by the sink again, rinsing a dish that did not need rinsing. I turned off the water and dried my hands carefully before facing him. "I did," I said. "They look very nice." He nodded, relieved, but there was something else beneath it. Anticipation. "Good," he replied. "We should probably finalize things soon. The sooner we get everything settled, the easier it will be." Easier for who, I wondered. I walked past him into the living room, gesturing lightly toward the couch. "Sit with me for a moment," I said. He hesitated, just briefly, before following. He sat on the edge of the cushion, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together as if he were preparing for a conversation he had already rehearsed. I took my usual seat across from him and studied his face. He looked older than I remembered, but not in the way that comes with time. In the way that comes with distance. "Daniel," I said quietly, "when did you decide all of this?" He blinked, caught off guard. "Decide what?" "That I could not live here anymore. That I needed to be somewhere else." He shifted in his seat, glancing away for a second before answering. "It is not like that, Mom. We just thought it would be better for you. Safer. You are alone here." Alone. The word hung in the air between us. I nodded slowly, letting it settle. "I have been alone before," I said. "I managed." He opened his mouth as if to respond, but I continued before he could. And the house? I asked, my voice still calm. What happens to it? That was when he hesitated. Not long, but long enough. We have not really figured that out yet, he said, his tone too casual, too quick. I held his gaze, waiting. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. I mean, it might make sense to sell it eventually. It is a lot to maintain. Eventually. Another word that sounded harmless on its own, but carried something heavier underneath. I leaned back slightly, folding my hands in my lap. Of course, I said softly. That would make sense. He relaxed a little then, as if he had passed some kind of test. But I could see it now. The way his answers came just a second too late. The way his words had already been shaped before he spoke them. This was not a conversation he was having with me. It was one he was repeating. I just want what is best for you, he added, his voice gentler now. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that does not quite reach the eyes. I know, I said. And I did know. I knew exactly what was best for me. He stayed for a few more minutes, talking about small things, work, the weather, anything that did not require him to look too closely at what was really happening. When he finally stood to leave, he paused by the door. We will get everything sorted this week, he said. Do not worry about anything. I nodded once. I will not, I replied. And for the first time since all of this had started, that was the truth. Because as I stood there watching him walk out of the house he believed would soon be his, I realized something with absolute clarity. They were not just rushing me out. They were rushing toward something. And I was going to find out exactly what it was. The next morning, I left the house just after 9, locking the door behind me with the same steady motion I had used for years, but this time I paused on the front porch for a second longer than usual. The air was cool, the kind that carried the faint smell of damp grass and distant traffic, and for a brief moment, everything looked exactly as it always had. My neighbor's mailbox was still slightly crooked. The oak tree in the yard still cast the same wide shadow across the driveway. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I drove across town without turning on the radio, letting the quiet settle around me as I replayed the past few days in my mind, each detail lining up more clearly with every mile. The speed, the certainty, the way Rebecca had already chosen a place before I had even agreed to go. This was not concern. This was a plan. I pulled into a small parking lot just before 10 and turned off the engine, sitting there for a moment as I looked at the familiar brick building in front of me. Harrison and Cole, attorneys at law. The sign had not changed in over a decade, and neither, I hoped, had the man inside. When I stepped through the door, the soft chime above it echoed lightly in the quiet reception area. A young woman behind the desk looked up and smiled politely. Good morning. How can I help you? I would like to see Mr. Harrison, I said, setting my purse gently on the counter. Margaret Collins. She nodded, typing something into her computer before picking up the phone. One moment, please. I stood there, taking in the room, the muted colors, the neatly arranged chairs, the faint scent of paper and coffee. It felt steady, grounded, a place where decisions were made carefully, not rushed through in a week. A moment later, a familiar voice came from the hallway. Margaret. I turned to see him standing there, older than I remembered, his hair now completely gray, but his posture still straight, his expression still sharp and attentive. It has been a while. It has, I replied, offering a small smile. May I come in? Of course, he said, stepping aside to let me pass. His office looked much the same as it had years ago. Shelves lined with files, a large desk near the window, everything in its place. He gestured for me to sit, and I did, placing my purse carefully on my lap. What can I do for you? He asked, settling into his chair. I took a breath, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted my words to be precise. My son and his wife are trying to move me into a nursing facility, I said. This week. His expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened slightly. And do you wish to go? No, I said simply. Then you do not have to, he replied just as calmly. The certainty in his voice settled something inside me. I reached into my purse and pulled out the folder I had brought, sliding it across the desk toward him. I found these, I said. My husband organized everything before he passed. I believe the house is in my name. He opened the folder, scanning the documents with practiced ease. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of paper shifting under his hands. After a moment, he looked up at me. Your husband was very thorough, he said. The property is entirely yours. No one can sell it, transfer it, or make decisions about it without your consent. I nodded once, letting that settle. And if someone were to try? I asked. He closed the folder and leaned back slightly. Then they would be acting without legal authority, which would not end well for them. There was no drama in his tone, no exaggeration, just fact. I folded my hands together in my lap, feeling a quiet clarity settle over me. They have already prepared documents, I said. Arrangements, payments, everything but my signature. He gave a small, knowing nod. That suggests urgency, he said. And usually, urgency benefits the person creating it. I allowed myself the faintest smile. That is what I thought. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk. What would you like to do, Margaret? I looked down at the folder for a moment, then back up at him. I would like to let them continue, I said. Just long enough for them to believe everything is going according to their plan. There was a brief pause, and then, slowly, he nodded. And then, I met his gaze steadily. Then I would like to remind them whose house this actually is. When I stepped back into the house that afternoon, nothing looked different, but I felt different. The door closed behind me with the same quiet click, yet the sound carried a sense of finality it had. Never had before. I placed my keys on the table and stood there for a moment, letting the stillness settle around me. This time, it did not feel heavy. It felt like space. Space to think. Space to act. I moved through the room slowly, just as I had the day before, but now I was not observing. I was deciding. In the kitchen, the stack of brochures Rebecca had brought sat neatly beside the admission papers, exactly where I had left them. I picked them up and flipped through the glossy pages, images of smiling seniors, manicured gardens, bright dining rooms filled with people who looked like they had already accepted something I was not willing to accept. I closed the brochure and set it back down carefully. This was the life they had chosen for me. A quiet removal. A soft disappearance. I turned and walked toward the hallway, my steps steady, my mind already mapping out what needed to be done. That evening, I began to pack. Not everything. Just enough to make it believable. A few clothes. Personal items. The kind of things someone would take if they thought they were leaving for good. I folded each piece carefully, placing it into a small suitcase I had not used in years. The zipper sounded louder than it should have when I closed it, as if the house itself was marking the moment. By the time I carried it into the living room, it looked convincing, real enough to satisfy anyone who was not looking too closely. The next day, Daniel and Rebecca arrived together. They did not knock this time. The door opened quickly, their voices already filling the space before they even stepped inside. "Mom, we brought some boxes," Daniel said, carrying in a stack of cardboard containers. Rebecca followed behind him, her eyes moving immediately to the suitcase near the couch. She smiled, not warmly, but with a quiet sense of confirmation. "I see you have started packing," she said. "That is good. It will make everything much easier." I nodded, keeping my expression calm, almost distant. "I thought it would help," I replied. Daniel set the boxes down and looked around the room, as if assessing what else needed to be done. "We can finish up the rest today," he said. "No need to drag it out." Of course, I thought. No need to give me time to reconsider. No need to slow down. Rebecca stepped further into the room, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she moved toward the coffee table. Her hand brushed lightly over the admission papers, straightening them, aligning them as if they were already signed. "We scheduled the move for Friday," she said, her tone casual, as if she were discussing a dinner reservation. "It is only about a 25-minute drive. Very convenient. Friday. 3 days away." I let the words settle in my mind, turning it over slowly. They had already chosen the date, already arranged the details, already moved forward without waiting for me to catch up. "That sounds fine," I said quietly. Daniel looked at me then, a flicker of something in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or relief. "Are you sure?" he asked. I met his eyes for just a moment before looking away. "I am sure," I said. Rebecca's smile widened slightly, just enough to reveal the satisfaction beneath it. "You are making the right decision," she said. I did not respond. Instead, I walked past them into the kitchen, reaching for the kettle and filling it with water. The simple, familiar action steadied me. Behind me, I could hear them talking in low voices, their words blending together into something indistinct but unmistakably coordinated. They believed this was working. They believed I was cooperating. And in a way, I was. I placed the kettle on the stove and turned the knob, watching as the flame flickered to life beneath it. The soft sound of gas igniting filled the quiet space for just a second before settling into a steady burn. I stood there, my hands resting lightly on the counter, and allowed myself a single, silent thought. Let them rush. Let them plan. Let them believe everything is already decided. Because the faster they moved, the less carefully they looked. And the less carefully they looked, the easier it would be for me to do exactly what I needed to do next. Friday arrived faster than it should have. The morning light came through the windows the same way it always did, soft and steady, but there was a different kind of energy in the air, something quiet but charged, like the moment just before a storm that never quite shows itself. I woke up early again, before 6, and moved through my usual routine without rushing. Coffee. The sound of the machine filling the silence. The faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet as I crossed the kitchen. Everything was familiar. Everything was controlled. I did not look at the suitcase by the door. I did not look at the stack of papers on the table. I did not need to. I already knew what they were waiting for. By 8:30, I heard the car pull into the driveway. 2 doors closing. Footsteps approaching with a kind of purpose that made it clear this was not just another visit. The front door opened, and Daniel's voice came first. "Mom, we are here." I stepped into the hallway just as they entered, already dressed, already prepared. Rebecca glanced at the suitcase and then at me, her expression settling into that same composed satisfaction I had come to recognize. "You are ready," she said. It was not a question. I gave a small nod. "I am." Daniel moved quickly, lifting the suitcase before I could reach for it, as if taking it from me confirmed something he needed to believe. "The car is packed," he said. "We can head out whenever you are ready." I watched him for a moment, noticing the way he avoided meeting my eyes again. Not out of guilt, out of habit. He had already decided this was the right thing. Or at least, he had convinced himself that it was. Rebecca stepped closer to the table, her fingers brushing lightly over the documents. "We just need to finalize a few signatures when we get there," she said. "It will not take long." Of course it would not, I thought. They had made sure of that. I walked toward the door slowly, pausing just long enough to let my gaze move across the room one more time. The photographs, the furniture, the small details that held years of my life in quiet, unspoken ways. I did not linger. I did not hesitate. I simply stepped forward. Outside, the air was cooler than I expected. The sky was clear, bright in a way that made everything feel sharper, more defined. Daniel placed the suitcase in the trunk and closed it. With a firm push, the sound echoing slightly in the stillness of the morning. "Ready?" he asked. I looked at him, really looked this time, and saw not the boy I had raised, but the man who believed he was in control of what came next. "Yes," I said calmly. We got into the car, Rebecca in the front seat, Daniel driving, and I sat in the back, watching the house through the window as we pulled away. It did not look smaller. It did not look distant. It looked exactly the same. Solid. Unchanged. Mine. The drive was quiet at first, the kind of silence that feels deliberate rather than accidental. Rebecca eventually began to speak, pointing out small things along the route, talking about the facility, the amenities, the schedule. Her voice was smooth, practiced, filled with details that were meant to reassure, but only confirmed how much thought had already gone into this. Daniel nodded occasionally, adding small comments, agreeing, reinforcing the narrative they had built together. I listened. I did not interrupt. I did not question. I simply let them speak. Because the more they spoke, the more certain they became. And the more certain they became, the less prepared they were for anything different. When we finally turned into the long driveway of the facility, the building came into view, large and carefully maintained, exactly as it had appeared in the brochures. Clean, orderly, controlled. Daniel parked the car and turned off the engine, the sudden silence settling over us again. "Here we are," he said, his voice almost light. Rebecca turned slightly in her seat, looking back at me with that same composed expression. "You are going to be comfortable here," she said. I met her gaze, holding it for just a second longer than necessary. "I am sure I will be," I replied. Daniel stepped out of the car, moving around to open my door, offering his hand as if this were a gesture of care rather than part of a plan. I accepted it without hesitation and stepped out onto the pavement. The building stood in front of us, quiet and waiting. They believed this was the end of something. A conclusion. A transition they had already controlled from beginning to finish. But as I stood there, looking at the entrance, I felt something else entirely. Not an ending. A moment. And moments, I had learned, could still be changed. The lobby was quiet when we walked in, the kind of quiet that felt carefully maintained, as if even the air had been instructed not to disturb anything. A woman at the front desk looked up and smiled, her expression warm but practiced, the same way Rebecca's had been all week. "Good morning," she said. "You must be Margaret." I nodded once. "I am." Daniel stepped forward immediately, taking over the conversation before I could say anything more. "Yes, we spoke on the phone earlier this week," he said. "We are here to complete the admission." Of course they were, I thought. Everything had already been decided. The woman gestured toward a small office just off the main hallway. "Right this way," she said. Rebecca moved first, her posture straight, her steps confident, as if she had walked this path before. Daniel followed, carrying my purse without asking, holding it like a responsibility he had already claimed. I walked behind them, steady, quiet, taking in every detail as we passed through the hallway. The soft carpet underfoot, the muted artwork on the walls, the distant sound of a television playing somewhere out of sight. It was exactly what they had promised. Controlled, predictable, final. Inside the office, the woman motioned for us to sit. A folder was already waiting on the desk, thick with papers, each one neatly arranged, each one prepared in advance. "We will just need a few signatures," she said, opening the folder and turning it toward me. "Then we can get you settled into your room." Rebecca leaned slightly closer, her eyes scanning the pages as if she already knew what they said. Daniel sat beside me, his body angled forward, ready, expectant. I looked down at the documents, my gaze moving slowly across the lines. My name, my information, terms and conditions written in careful language designed to sound reassuring while quietly removing control. I did not reach for the pen. Not yet. The woman waited patiently, her hands folded on the desk. Rebecca shifted slightly in her seat. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom," he said gently, "it is just paperwork." I lifted my eyes and looked at him, really looked at him, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. "I know," I said calmly. Then I reached into my purse. Not for a pen, for the envelope I had placed there that morning. I set it on the desk, sliding it toward the center, between the folder they had prepared and the hands that expected me to sign it. "Before we do this," I said, my voice steady, even, "there is something I need you both to see." Rebecca's expression changed first, just slightly, a tightening around the eyes, a pause in her breathing. Daniel frowned, confused, his hand hovering just above the papers as if unsure whether to continue or stop. I opened the envelope slowly, deliberately, and removed the documents inside. The same ones I had reviewed the night before. The same ones my husband had prepared years ago, long before any of this had begun. I placed them on the desk, aligning them carefully, the way I always had when something mattered. "What is that?" Daniel asked. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I turned the top page toward them, letting the words speak before I did. Property ownership. Sole title. My name. Not his. Not theirs. Mine. The silence that followed was different from any we had shared before. This one was not empty. It was full. Full of realization. Full of something shifting in a way neither of them had anticipated. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her eyes moving quickly across the page, searching for something that would undo what she was seeing. There was nothing. Daniel's expression changed more slowly. Confusion first, then doubt, then something else, something closer to understanding. "This house," I said quietly, "has been in my name for years." My voice did not rise. It did not need to. No one can sell it. No one can transfer it. No one can make decisions about it except me. I paused, letting the words settle, letting them feel the weight of what they had overlooked. Including this. I gestured lightly toward the admission papers still sitting untouched on the desk. The woman across from us remained silent, her professional composure intact, but her eyes had shifted, her attention no longer on the forms, but on me. Rebecca sat back slowly, her posture no longer as confident as it had been when we walked in. Daniel's hand dropped from the table, his fingers curling slightly, as if he were trying to grasp something that was no longer there. I folded my hands together in my lap, and met their eyes one last time. Calm, steady, certain. Because for the first time since this had begun, the plan they had built was no longer moving forward. It had stopped. And now, it was their turn to catch up. No one spoke for several seconds. The kind of silence that does not feel empty, but heavy, like something has shifted and has not yet settled. Daniel was the first to look away. His eyes dropped to the documents again, then back to me, as if he were trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer matched. "Mom," he said slowly, "why did you not tell me this?" I held his gaze, calm, steady. "You did not ask," I replied. It was not said with anger. It did not need to be. Rebecca's composure was different now. Not gone, but fractured. She reached for the papers again, flipping through them more quickly this time, her movements no longer precise, no longer controlled. "There must be something else," she said, her voice tighter than before. "This does not change the fact that it is better for you to be here." I let a small pause settle between us before answering. "Better for me," I repeated quietly. "Or better for you?" That was when she stopped. Completely. The room seemed to narrow, the quiet pressing in just enough to make every word matter. Daniel shifted in his chair, his shoulders no longer squared, his posture no longer certain. "We were just trying to help," he said, but even he did not sound convinced. I nodded once, acknowledging the words without accepting them. "I am sure that is what you told yourselves," I said. Then I reached forward and closed the folder of admission papers, sliding it gently back toward the woman at the desk. "I will not be signing these," I added. My voice remained even, controlled, leaving no room for interpretation. The woman nodded professionally, gathering the documents without comment, her attention shifting back to neutrality, but the moment had already changed. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her hands now resting tightly in her lap, her eyes no longer meeting mine directly. Daniel looked at me again, this time longer, searching for something he had overlooked. "So what happens now?" he asked. I stood slowly, smoothing my hands over the front of my coat, the motion simple, deliberate. "Now," I said, "I go home." The word home hung in the air, solid and unshaken. I turned toward the door, pausing just long enough to glance back at them. Not with anger, not with triumph, just clarity. "And you both can decide what you want to do next," I added quietly. Neither of them moved immediately. They were still catching up, still adjusting to a reality that had shifted without their permission. I walked out of the office and into the hallway, my steps steady, the sound of them soft against the carpet. The building looked the same as it had when we arrived. Clean, orderly, controlled. But it no longer felt like something meant for me. Outside, the air was still cool, the light just as bright. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in, feeling the difference settle fully into place. A few seconds later, I heard the door open behind me. Daniel stepped out first, his expression uncertain, his movements slower now. Rebecca followed, quieter than I had ever seen her. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice lower, less certain than before. I turned to face him, waiting. He hesitated, searching for words that no longer came easily. "We did not know," he said finally. "No," I replied. "You did not." And that was the truth. They had not known because they had never asked, because they had assumed, because they had believed control came from acting first, from deciding quickly, from leaving no space for resistance. I held his gaze for one more moment, then stepped past him, walking toward the car. Not his car. Mine. It was still parked exactly where I had left it, untouched, waiting. I reached into my purse, took out my keys, and unlocked the door with a quiet click. Before getting in, I looked back once more. They were standing near the entrance, side by side, but not as united as before. Something had shifted between them too. Something they would have to face without me. I opened the car door and sat down, placing my hands on the steering wheel, letting the familiar shape ground me.